So you guys know Saudi Arabia is trying to get Republicans elected this November, right? This isn't a particularly controversial statement. The Intercept is running with it, and analysts who really know Saudi Arabia, like Bruce Riedel, are also saying this. Put simply, Saudi Arabia has chosen to cut the world oil supply, which should hike up U.S. gas prices right before the all-important November congressional elections. For the past 2 years, Joe Biden has been governing this country with a majority of just 8 congresspeople in the House of Representatives, and with Vice President Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote in the Senate. If this goes away, Washington, D.C. spends the next 2 years doing nothing but government shutdowns, Biden family investigations, and impeachment proceedings. The single most important factor in the congressional elections on November 8th is probably the price of gasoline. And Saudi Arabia chose to announce taking 2 million barrels of oil a day off the market on October 5th. It's the very definition of an election-changing October surprise. This is particularly irritating because Saudi Arabia is making this happen through the OPEC Plus structure established in 2016. OPEC Plus includes many other countries, but it is essentially a price-fixing arrangement between Saudi Arabia and Russia, the world's number 2 and number 3 oil producers. The Biden administration is outraged. Anybody who cares about our war in Ukraine is outraged. This is being portrayed as a betrayal or an outright slap in the face from Saudi Arabia to the entire United States of America. But that's not what's really going on here. Folks keep pretending that Saudi Arabia is an independent country. Supposedly Saudi Arabia is some sort of independent Westphalian actor, doing what's best for its people, or at least for its elites. If this were true, I would agree with the people talking about some sort of grand, pro-Russia, shocking betrayal. But it's not true. Saudi Arabia is not an independent political actor. It is a U.S. colony entirely dependent on U.S. military equipment and support. Saudi money is poured into the U.S. economy on a grand scale, both as insurance policies for the Saudi royal family and in the form of outright bribes for U.S. politicians. It would be absolutely insane for Saudi Arabia to act against the United States this openly. That's not what they're doing. They are acting within the U.S. political system, and they are acting in support of the Republican Party. Saudi Arabia is more vulnerable than most, but this is what all of the world's political actors are reduced to now in this third decade of the second American century. Last week, I laid out how Washington, D.C.'s 21-year program of chaos has left all potential rivals in a shambles. If the United States is unified in wanting something, there is nothing that the rest of the world can do about it. Did you catch the key qualifier there? U.S. demands are irresistible if the U.S. political system is unified behind those demands. That's the saving grace for the rest of the world here in the 21st century. U.S. polarization. Without U.S. political divisions, the world would be subject to an even more demanding and regimented U.S. world system. China, the most powerful non-US country, is a great example of this dynamic. China spent the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s using the US and the world's resources to build an economic miracle. It was able to do this because it convinced enough American actors that China's economic growth was good for the United States as well. China's economic and diplomatic failures across the 2010s stem from the Chinese failure to keep the majority of US political actors on their side. The U.S. has barely begun to seriously attack China's economy, and the effects have already been disastrous for China. The China dream is still supported by some large U.S. businesses, but that clout is steadily slipping away, as last week's sweeping limits on Chinese technology reveal. Saudi Arabia is in an even weaker position in the long term. But in the short term, it has a lot more U.S. political support than the recent news reporting would make you think. Compare Saudi Arabia's relative freedom on oil prices to their constraints on Israel. This may seem surprising now, but throughout the 20th century, Saudi Arabia defined itself as a firm opponent of Israel. This opposition was fundamental to their idea of themselves as leaders of the Muslim and Arab worlds. And when the old king finally dies, this fundamental aspect of Saudi identity is expected to be completely renounced by the Saudi government. Because when the US political scene is unified on a topic, as it is with Israel, Saudi Arabia has no choice but to do as it is told. This is not the case with oil prices. The most shocking enemy Saudi Arabia made this month is Bob Menendez, one of the most powerful Democrats in the Senate, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Menendez is one of the century's greatest warmongers. Bob Menendez desperately wants to create a U.S. war with Iran for his defense industry bosses, and Saudi Arabia has always looked like a good path to get there. But it now seems like Bob Menendez has truly turned on the Saudis. This is significant, but it's not quite as significant as it looks. Menendez's loyalties have shifted because Saudi Arabia is directly threatening his personal power as a Democrat. And Saudi Arabian defense spending is all of a sudden a lot less important than NATO's. But there are other powers in US politics that are more than fine with Saudi Arabia's choice to limit oil production. And I'm not talking about the Republicans. I'm talking about a US entity that is vastly more powerful than the weapon-mad political parties that govern us. I'm talking about the US oil industry. The oil industry is not as involved with day-to-day government as the war industry is, but its preferences matter, and they prefer higher oil prices. More sophisticated oil industry analysts than myself have pointed out that this OPEC Plus cut may be more of an acknowledgement of reality than an actual production cut. A decade of underinvestment has left OPEC Plus in a situation where they can barely meet their production targets. But whether or not this Saudi action has any real-world effects, it matters for the elections. Because markets are dumb. Whether there is any effect on the real world or not, OPEC Plus cuts are an upward pressure on oil and gas prices everywhere, which makes the US petroleum industry very happy. In the short term, I think Saudi Arabia is right to gamble that Republicans working with the oil industry will keep their weapons sales from being disrupted and will keep the US-Saudi relationship limping along for another few years. But this Saudi move is a real risk, and losing Bob Menendez, if they really have lost him, is a significant loss. So why are they betting on the Republicans so hard? Well, I think it's two things. The first thing is 9/11 and what the Republican Party did to cover up the fact that Saudi Arabia was the country most responsible for that attack. 15 of 19 hijackers, the ideology, the leadership, and the funding for that attack were all Saudi Arabian. And we all knew most of that on September 12th. But in 2001, we still needed Saudi oil, and Republican leadership used the unprecedented American unity they commanded to shift the focus from Saudi Arabia and avoid finding any more direct connections between the Saudi government and the attacks. In the decades since, many reports have emerged of the struggles of the FBI agents who were stymied in their attempts to investigate by the Bush administration. Every few years now, revelations of Saudi royal family Al-Qaeda connections slip out that would have left Riyadh a smoking ruin if they were known in 2002. While I don't doubt that there were dedicated members of the 9/11 Commission, it's pretty clear to me that they were steered away from any mention of Saudi Arabia beyond the FBI findings that they had no choice but to include. You guys have heard me rant about 9/11 before, so I don't want to go into it at too much length, but I recently found a new sort of smoking gun that I think I should mention. You remember Bruce Riedel from the beginning of the video, right? He's an interesting figure who has kind of gone to war against Saudi Arabia since their invasion of Yemen in 2015. But before that, he was a consummate insider. He worked for the CIA for 3 decades and finished up with 5 years on the National Security Council, directly advising the presidents and their staff. Throughout his career, he focused on Saudi Arabia, formed personal relationships with its leading figures, and led U.S. policy on the country for the Clinton and early Bush administrations. So he was the U.S. government's point man on Saudi Arabia for 4 years leading up to 9/11 and on 9/11 itself. And on page 134 of his 2016 book, Kings and Presidents, he just sort of casually mentions that the 9/11 Commission never even asked to interview him. That's what we call a cover-up, folks. And that is what the Republican Party did for Saudi Arabia. But that's ancient history. The unity of George W. Bush's first term in office had completely evaporated by 2006, if not before. Saudi Arabia wasn't going to just keep supporting the Republicans out of loyalty. No, they ensured their ownership of that party by buying that party's leadership. This isn't really a controversial point either. During Trump's administration, there were plenty of reports about Saudi Arabia paying for Trump hotel rooms they never used. But in 2021, the purchase became even more obvious. Saudi Arabia simply wrote a $2 billion check. A $2 billion check to Jared Kushner, the husband of Trump's beloved daughter Ivanka. Even the Saudi Arabian Wealth Fund thought this was a bad investment, but they were overridden by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Saudi Arabia now owns the Republican Party. Between the U.S. oil industry that secretly loves production cuts and the Republican Party whose leadership MBS has purchased, I think Saudi Arabia is probably right that they can put their favored party back in power without too many short-term consequences. The only wild card here is the Republican voter. Are they happy supporting the 9/11 cover-up party? In the long term, I remain convinced that the Saudi royal family is screwed. Think back to the subtle power of the oil industry. They are a big fan of Saudi Arabian production cuts. But over the past decade, they've also learned how useful the US military and US sanctions can be in shutting down competing petrostates like Iraq, Iran, Libya, Venezuela, and now Russia. Big Oil has welcomed Saudi attempts to shut down production. But what happens when Big Oil realizes they can shut down a lot more Saudi production by turning against the country than by working with it? Saudi Arabia may find themselves missing all of those democratic warmongers they have alienated this month. Donald Trump and his power aren't going to last forever. Saudi Arabia might need to worry about the next time US opinion on their country is unified. It won't be like 2001 when Washington, D.C. rallied together to cover up the Saudi role in 9/11 because we needed their oil. Washington, D.C. might just unite to take out the final competition to U.S. oil and gas export dominance. That's Saudi Arabia. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. Click the bell next to the subscribe button if you want an update whenever I upload a new video. Thanks.